Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I've had to throw away some of my earlier notes because of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump and the fact that that is understandably dominating the news. And rather than repeat everything, let's have a think about what the event means for Australia. In my view, it strengthens his chances of re-election, which were already looking good, particularly following President Biden's absolutely disastrous debate performance. Now, it was credibly reported that while president, and after recovering from COVID, Donald Trump was planning to go out onto a balcony and unveil himself in a Superman suit. So I expect nothing less this time to also maximise publicity. And as a consequence of that, I also expect that his popularity will jump further. Briefly on the presidential debate, the subsequent efforts to explain it all away as Joe Biden having a cold or just a bad day were an insult to the intelligence of about 51 million people who watched it, including me, for the first 15 minutes, and then I had to turn it off because what we saw was clear evidence of someone very sadly in cognitive decline, as in Biden. And in contrast, Donald Trump, even though he came out with the usual fire hose of lies, managed at least to act coherent during just about all of his performances. Now, many analysts argue that life under Trump will be business as usual because the Australia-US alliance is so strong. Now, I'm far from convinced that this is actually the case, and I'm not sure that Australia should automatically go along with whatever Donald Trump's new foreign policy looks like, which at the very least is likely to be soft on Russia, tough on Europe, and I would say a degree of uncertainty regarding what's going to happen for the Asia-Pacific region. Now, surveys, like the ones done every year or so by the Lowy Institute, consistently show that close to 40% of Australians want a more independent, less pro-Washington foreign policy. The same surveys show that about 25% of people, Australians, are rusted on all the way with the US-type people. So when you do the numbers and you combine the people in favour of a more independent foreign policy with those who don't know or unsure, that means that 70% of Australians are actually unhappy with the direction of both this government and also the coalition, which likewise are doing the all the way with the US thing. The reason why this pattern continues, despite the majority of Australians wanting something a little bit more independent, is that very few people change their voting behaviour over foreign policy. It's typically between 5th and 10th on the list after the economy, immigration, climate change, that sort of stuff. And politicians are smart enough to know that they can keep on, if you like, defying or ignoring the popular will because it's not going to have any consequences for them at the ballot box. Now, I might also say that when our politicians go to the United States, they are treated very well in terms of protocol and access, and anyone who is not really very well grounded can have their heads turned by that and be inordinately impressed with the attention that they're receiving. And very frankly, I don't regard our current crop of politicians as being particularly well grounded. Now, I'm not being anti-US here. The United States is Australia's most important security partner. It has the world's most powerful military, and that's likely to remain the case for many years to come. But I always have a flash of irritation when our politicians, such as our Prime Minister yesterday, after the shooting, droned on about shared values with the US. Well, I'm struggling with that concept Because other than speaking a version of the English language, we have different economies, different systems of government, and radically different approaches to social services, particularly things like healthcare. Now, the US is so polarized, it's in a situation where half of the voting population absolutely believe that the 2020 presidential election was stolen and that President Biden is there illegally. They also believe that all of the various criminal charges against Trump have been fabricated and that all of the judges must be corrupt Democrats. And I'll also add, at least Australia has strict gun laws, which the US might wish to contemplate, which of course they won't, because the Trump shooter was using a military-grade AR-15 assault rifle, and even though apparently he was himself barely able to shoot straight, he was able to spray enough high-velocity bullets in the direction of Trump that he ended up escaping death by about 3 centimetres. So, looking at the possibility of another Donald Trump presidency, I don't see that there are any guarantees that he will be particularly interested in sticking with AUKUS Pillar 1. And I'll come back to that in a moment to talk a bit about how you do business planning. Now, in my lifetime, the US has already turned its back on Asia on one very clear, memorable occasion, and that was during the Nixon presidency after 1969. It was called either the Guam doctrine or the Nixon doctrine, and it was a reaction to, in particular, to the disaster of the Vietnam involvement, and basically said that from that point on, the US would supply a nuclear umbrella, but it was up to countries to look after their own self-defense and security. Now, that's all on the historical record. I'm not making this up. If people are interested, they can go and have a look. I suspect that our current group of politicians don't show that much interest in military history or history generally and would prefer to spend their time mainly on the golf course, as far as I can tell. Anyway, getting back to the impact of the Nixon doctrine, for Australia, this actually led indirectly to things like the Collins submarine program, the Anzac frigate program, and JORN, because there was a realization amongst the smarter policy makers and the smarter politicians that Australia was just going to have to do more to fit in with this doctrine, and therefore we had to become more independent. Now, of course, all of that has been thrown away, deliberately thrown away. We've wrecked the submarine building industry that was set up in the 2000s. We've wrecked the naval shipbuilding sector that was around at the same time. Okay, we're trying to breathe a bit of life back into that, but it would have been better if everything had remained in place. Anyway, in the last 20 years, all of that has been thrown away in the blind hope that the US will always be there. And personally, I don't believe that's a particularly sound bet. Before returning to that very large theme, let's have a look at a couple of things that have happened in the last few days that constituted some good news. At the NATO summit in Washington, Australia announced a further donation of $250 million worth of military equipment. That includes, I read, guided missiles. Now, I've been calling, as regular listeners would know, for RBS-70s. That's our short-range ground-to-air missiles that are being phased out. I've been calling on them to be donated, so hopefully they are still part of the package. But another thing that does nothing for my mood, why on earth is our embassy in Kiev still closed? I mean, this is just beyond ridiculous. When every other country, there are about 50 countries that are kind of part of the Ukraine support group, they've all reopened their embassies in Kiev, but we stubbornly refuse to do so. And of course, every time that I talk about Kiev or Ukraine, I have to mention the disgrace of destroying Taipan helicopters. Why not have donated them to Ukraine? And I mean, some people still say, oh, well, we did the Ukrainians a favor by not donating them because they're expensive and difficult to maintain. Well, we had about 40 fully functioning Taipan helicopters. We could have donated the lot. Ukraine could have cannibalized half of them, and still had a perfectly good operating fleet of around 20. Anyway, we'll park that to one side. Now, there's also some news that Australia was buying, or the Army was going to acquire, some Switchblade 300 kamikaze drones, small things, carry about a kilo or a couple of kilos of explosives, loitering munitions. Yeah, good, about time. But what is really needed is for them to be mass-produced, not buying a few dozen from the United States, and there are actually a few Australian options which have been totally ignored. And I'll do a shout out here to a company called C2 Robotics. I've mentioned them in the past, doing the spear-tooth large uninhabited underwater vehicle. Well, they also have a very neat little kamikaze drone called Ogre. And again, about a 1 kilo payload. It has some sort of terrain matching optical guidance system. That 1 kilo is more than enough. The warhead for an RPG is 730 grams. NATO M67 grenade is 430 grams. And by the way, I mentioned the NATO grenade because about a decade ago, in a visit to Israel, I was there as a guest of the company IAI, and they showed me a little quadcopter. And the thing was about the size of a shoebox with fold-out propellers at each corner. And its concept was that its warhead, it didn't need its own separate warhead. You'd fly it with 2 of these NATO M67 grenades in it. So you'd turn to your mate, in a squad, everyone carries as many grenades as they can. You'd put a couple of grenades in it, off it would go with a little imaging camera. And if it would see a target of opportunity, it would, you could fly it into it. It had 2 modes of detonation, either detonation on impact or detonation via the command link. And I thought at the time myself, well, why don't we get some of these and start playing around with them, learning how to use them? Anyway, that was a missed opportunity, but C2 Robotics is not. They're building these things in Australia. Rather than importing the solution, we should be developing our own product. Now, what else? Last week, very flatteringly, I was asked to speak at the initial Australia Republic of Korea Defence Forum. This is an initiative from Korea, and my talk was mainly for the benefit of the Australian audience about how powerful South Korean defence industry is and why Australia should be taking greater advantage of closer links with the ROK. And I mentioned a couple of examples. The Redback infantry fighting vehicle that Hanwha is now under contract to deliver. They had to build 3 prototypes for the Australian risk mitigation activity, and the first of these they produced in 6 months. That's 6 months from getting the specification to doing the design to building the thing. 6 months, start to finish. Okay, it was a prototype, it wasn't perfect, but that gives, in the Western world, not just Australia, it typically takes years for this to be done. And in a previous episode, I also mentioned the KDX destroyers, the Batch 2 destroyers, 11,000 tons, 128 vertical launch missile cells, construction in 9 months. Compare that with the glacial pace of the Hunter-class frigate program. And on this theme of how quickly South Korea can do things, I think that's one of their most important points, the speed of delivery and the quality of the stuff that they're producing. It's completely ridiculous to assert, as the independent review team into the surface fleet and defence do, that it is impossible to have a general-purpose frigate in the water by 2029 that includes the Australian Saab LV combat system and the Australian CEA radar suite. I mean, you could also, as I've said, have a Lursen corvette in the water by 2027, actually, with 9LV, because it's already there in the Arafura class, and it's also there in the Bulgarian C-90 corvettes, which Lursen are building. I've touched on this before. Now, back to this forum. I was gratified that there were some defence and ADF people there, but in my opinion, not nearly enough. If some minor functionaries had come out from the US, there would have been 10 times the number, but at least they were there. Now, from the South Korean side of things, and this is the government, not industry, this is the government offering to cooperate, especially in cyber and space. Now, there was an offer put on the table to co-fund a spaceport. Why isn't Defence rushing to the ROK to make progress on this? I mean, maybe they are. I missed out on most of the presentation because I was conducting a separate interview, but I got there at the very end of the presentation. The official was sitting at my table, and so I said to him, are you serious about co-funding a spaceport? He said, yes, absolutely. He said, it's not that we have the budget right this second, but if Australia is interested, we certainly are, and we would love to sit down and have a talk about how it could be done cooperatively. So there you are, Defence. I think it's a fantastic idea. Now, another one, in the Australian Future Surface Fleet, there's this reference to, in the mid-2030s, acquiring 6 large optionally manned surface vessels that will be carrying a lot of missiles. Guess what? South Korea, or the South Korean Navy, is also working on this sort of concept. They've labelled the whole thing Ghost Ship. I've got an official document. I'll see if I can get it online. And it lays out a roadmap for all of the autonomous work that they want to do with surface ships and underwater ships, and from small to very large. So, once again, rather than buy something from the US, a fully imported solution, let's co-develop it with the Republic of Korea. We already know that Korea is genuinely open to co-development of advanced systems because Indonesia is a partner on their KF-21 supersonic twin-engine jet fighter. Now, mind you, Indonesia is a bit behind in their payments, and I'm not sure how much of their technology is involved, but the basic point is Korea is genuinely open-minded to cooperation. And on the KF-21, a country like Australia would have been a much more reliable partner, but we seem to have no interest in that at all, and I find it an irony that we're transferring huge amounts of money to the industrial bases of the UK and the US, but we are not interested in transferring huge amounts of money to our own industrial base. And because of these huge cash transfers, let's speak of other things we can't afford. I previously said we aren't getting any more F-35s, we aren't getting logistic support ships, we aren't getting a mine countermeasures capability. Well, we also aren't getting ground-to-air missiles of the medium to long-range category, like the Patriot system being so effectively used in Ukraine. Its casualty of the DSR, that we now have Air 6500, and I'll have a lot more to say about that in the next episode. It's developing the command and control architecture, but the future phases of weapons, no, that's been scrapped, with someone in defence saying, oh, well, the technology is immature. Well, that is total 100% BS. The technology is extremely mature. You've got, as I mentioned, Patriot from the United States, or the European SAM-T, or the Israeli Arrow-David's Sling combination. And there's another player, you guessed it, South Korea. South Korea is also developing their range of advanced ground-to-air missiles. We've got to change the paradigm, folks. We've got to get out of this mindset of just over and over and over again buying FMS from the US. Let's look at co-production. Let's look at seeing how much more we can actually do in Australia. I had a fair bit more to say, again, about the Korean conference. I've run out of time. I'll elaborate in the next episode. Thank you for listening. Bye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.